Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're focusing on a Russian general and civil reformer that's not that well known in the West, but certainly among the Cossack people he's revered as something of a father of the people, something of a folk hero. And this is the Russian general Matvei Platov. Now I'm going to apologise in advance for any Russian speakers, especially native Russian speakers, because it's an absolutely beautiful language and I'm going to mangle it more than I mangle most languages. So I want to apologise in advance for that. And also my main resource that I've used on this chap's life was in Russian. And so I've tried to translate it on Google Translate. And it's basically the infinite monkey typewriter project when it comes to Google Translate. So hopefully it'll make sense. If I get anything wrong, then it's probably my fault because I've misinterpreted the translation. But General Matvei Platov, here we go. Matvei Ivanovich Platov was born on August the 6th, 1751, in the village of Staro Cherkasy to parents of very modest means, his father being a sergeant in the Russian army. There's a lovely, but I can't imagine for a second true story about Platov Sr., his father, and he was out doing his sort of daily business. Now, in the 18th century, in the Russian army, it was enlistment for life. So most soldiers, they weren't soldiering 100% of the time. They would take on a civilian profession as well. And Platov Sr., he was something of, shall we say, an import-export guy. So he had a lot of ships and barges that would, take his goods around the Russian steppe. So he was out doing his daily business, and a bird flew over him and dropped a piece of bread on his hat. So, old man Platov crossed himself, thanked God, picked up the piece of bread off his hat and put it into his pocket. Then, going to the shore of the river, and suddenly a huge carp jumped out of the river and landed at his feet. Once again, Platov crossed himself, thank God, and he was so excited by this windfall that he completely forgot his day's business and rushed home to be greeted with the news that his son had been born. So, because he had the bread delivered by the bird and the carp delivered by, I guess the carp jumping out, he had the provisions to invite the whole village round to his house. He obviously had plenty of vodka stashed away, and they partied into the night to celebrate the coming of young Matvei Platov. Now, I'm not saying for a second that I think this story is true. In fact, I think a bird dropping a piece of bread on a guy's head and a carp jumping out of the river is almost certainly not true. But I include it for two reasons. One, because it's quite a fun little story, and two, just to show this is the kind of person that we're dealing with here. He is a mythological figure almost, that his birth has been celebrated by the fates or the gods, and, he's brought so much greatness to the Cossack people because of this. So I've hopefully tried to take out some of the less believable things and try to keep in the stuff that we know is true. We've got quite a few records for him. So hopefully there's not going to be too much mythologizing in here. But, I might slip in the odd bit here and there, but I'll let you know when I do. In Romanov, Russia, proper formal schooling would have seen the students sent to Moscow, Kiev, St. Petersburg, or maybe Vorozhne, particularly if you were a Cossack. But certainly not rural Cherkassk, which is where the young Platov was born. And it was also incredibly expensive as well, think sort of public school prices. So Platov's formal education consisted of learning to read and write in Russian. Aware of his lack of formal education, his father tried to supplement the education by teaching him the qualities of the Cossack: orthodox Christianity, to obey and honour the hetman, devotion to the sovereign, and passionate adoration of the motherland, represented by the mighty Don River. The other vital parts of Cossack life that his father taught him were hunting, fishing, shooting, both firearms and bows, and most importantly of all, horsemanship. Cossacks were said to be born in the saddle, and Platov's horsemanship, whilst probably a little bit rough for the riding schools of Vienna or Madrid, was excellent. In 1764, at the age of 13, the young Platov was enrolled in the army of Catherine the Great, and he was enrolled as a sergeant. Now, this is one of those mythology bits. I'm going to read this almost word for word from the translation. It said that his father placed him on his horse and said, "Look, Matthew, serve the Empress and quiet Don about. Remember me. From simple Cossacks I came to the rank of troop sergeant through exemplary courage and service. Take care of your father's habits. Remember you are a Cossack. Trust in the Lord, and he will not leave you. Listen to your chiefs. Be considerate to those equal to you, and indulgent to the lower, and severe most of all to yourself. But remember always, never, Matthew, forget our quiet Don, that nourished and cherished you. Go now. Amen. Again, almost certainly apocryphal, but I really like the way it puts across what the Cossacks believe a young Cossack on their make should hear. So I included it for that reason. Nowhere was the gap between men and officers as pronounced as it was in the Russian army of the 18th century. With most soldiers being enrolled for life, they were treated a little better than slaves, with corporal and capital punishments being decided at the discretion of the regimental officers. The men would often be put to work on the officers' estates and were literally the property of the colonels. Cossacks, however, were very different. Rather than the patronage and backstabbing of the official Russian army, the Cossacks still maintained an almost tribal system where ranks were earned by merit and trust within the unit. While not quite as formal as the revolutionary French system of electing officers, it was a system rooted in centuries of tradition. In only 2 years, Platov became a Yasol, a rank similar to sergeant. In 1771, Russia launched a Crimean campaign against the Ottomans, and serving Prince Dolgoruki, Platov, still only 20, distinguished himself sufficiently that he was promoted to hetman, that's colonel of a Cossack regiment. As I've alluded to, Cossacks were still basically a tribal people, and the regiments will be made up of a single Cossack ethnicity, be that Don, Rostov, Crimean, etc. But Platov's regiment was slightly different in that it was a mixture of different tribes, although these tribes were still probably fairly local to each other. After this campaign, he and his men were stationed in the south of the Russian Empire and engaged mainly in border patrolling actions, often actually against different kinds of different tribes of Cossacks. Between 1774 and 1784, he fought against the Crimean Tartars. In 1774, and again in 1782, he had these campaigns serving under Alexander Suvorov, and he was something of an unofficial ADC, fighting in the Kuban Valley and what are now Chechnya and Dagestan. While these border skirmishes don't really feature in the great works of the Napoleonic Wars, they were a great training ground for Platov, and during these campaigns he earned a slew of accolades. In 1790 he fought against the Ottomans and was awarded the Order of St. George 4th Class for his participation in the capture of Ochakov, and after the actions at Ataman, Bender and Kushani, for which he was promoted to Brigadier General. Such an officer would not go unnoticed by the imperial court, especially as the Russo-Ottoman War was closely overseen by Potemkin, and in 1791 the 40-year-old General Platov rode to St. Petersburg for an audience with Catherine herself. During this audience, the Empress had a long conversation with Platov, alone, just the two of them. She had a long conversation with him about the Cossacks, the army, the Don, and that whole area of Russia. And soon, the whole of St. Petersburg knew that the young general from the Don was here. Now, to the urbane, civilized courtiers who prided themselves on being the equals of any European capital, this Cossack must have seemed like a monkey or a man from a completely different planet. But even to them, his bravery could not be denied. And when Catherine awarded him a sword decorated with diamonds, it had the inscription on it, "For bravery." This sabre is now kept at the Museum of the Don in the city of Novocherkassk, and we'll certainly hear more about that later. While he was there, he was also awarded the Order of St. George 3rd Class for the storming of the fortified town of Izmail in 1790, in which over 25,000 Ottomans were killed. Additionally, for his bravery during the assault, he was promoted to Ataman of the Ekaterinoslav and Chugev Cossacks. And then on the 12th of January 1793, he was promoted to Major General. Perhaps not entirely related to the fact that he was known at court, shall we say. This promotion came during the Persian campaign, and in 1796, also in this campaign, he was awarded the Order of Vladimir 3rd Class and another golden sword for his courage. However, as was always the case in the Russian court, great success led to great bitterness, and with the death of Catherine in 1796, her son Paul I ascended to the throne. Now, it's quite an interesting one. If you've seen the video on the Russian infantry, I talk about this a little bit there. Paul absolutely despised his mother with a passion, and so the court underwent a sweeping change, and Catherine's favourites found themselves at best out in the cold, at worst in prison, Perhaps even worse than that, dead. Although, maybe that's a comparative thing. Because in 1799, Platov was in St. Petersburg, and being a general, he was now very much in the centre of the imperial court, and caught up in its machinations. He asked permission from the new Tsar to leave St. Petersburg and return to the Don to visit his family. However, in his absence, those who wished to see this Cossack monkey learn his rightful place persuaded Paul that Platov was in fact going to stir up a Cossack revolt, and so the Russian secret police arrested him and imprisoned him in Kostroma. From there, Platov was moved back to St. Petersburg and entered the cold and damp casemates of the Peter and Paul fortress. However, luckily for him, Platov had his supporters too, and after verifying his innocence, the Emperor awarded him with the Commander's Cross of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, this also led to an appointment on the disastrous expedition to India in 1800. After Paul's super in no way suspicious death in 1805 and the accession of Alexander I, Platov was back in and promoted to Lieutenant General and Pokhidini Ataman, which means campaign leader, although it's almost silly to pronounce that way. He was pronounced campaign leader of the Don Cossacks, with a transfer to their new capital of Novocherkassk. And so it was that the son of a sergeant became the effective commander of all Cossack forces in Russia. Well, in name at least. But Hetman Platov was not like most Russian generals. Not for him the endless balls and running of civilian businesses. Instead, he set about organising the Cossacks more formally and training his units to be the best in the army. He considered a Cossack to be a natural soldier and demanded that fathers taught their children military affairs. Platov himself lived simply. He is quoted as saying, "We are not born to walk on parquet floors or to sit on velvet cushions. That would make us forget our native craft. Our business is walking across the field, the swamps, and sit in tents, or better still, under the open sky to the sun and heat and sky. Bad weather are no burden. Live so, and you'll always be a Don Cossack." Platov was overseeing these reforms in 1805, and so missed the Battle of Austerlitz and the ensuing campaign. But he did join the army as it moved to support the Prussians in 1806, and commanded a Cossack corps in East Prussia and Poland, fighting against the French at Eylau, Gutstadt, and Friedland. For his efforts, he received the Orders of St. George, second class, and of St. Alexander Nevsky, and the Prussian Order of the Black Eagle and of the Red Eagle. After Friedland, when the Treaty of Tilsit was being negotiated, well, the treaty that would become known as the Treaty of Tilsit was being negotiated, Napoleon and Alexander had a week-long festival. It was kind of like a love-in. And at this, Napoleon asked to speak to General Platov, the commander of the forces that had harassed his troops so effectively. During the audience, the Emperor told him that he had heard that Don Cossacks were great archers and asked him to show his art. Platov brought his ornate bow forth, and in the presence of the Emperors, Alexander and Napoleon, let a few arrows at the targets. Napoleon was incredibly surprised by the accuracy and the power of the shots and gave the Don Hetman some expensive snuff. Platov, refusing to be in the debt of the French Emperor, gave Napoleon his bow to honour the memory. That is super badass. Platov was now firmly ensconced in the imperial court. Not only did he have the full confidence of Alexander, but he also had allies from the previous Tsars. The widow of Paul, Maria Feodorovna, was especially fond of the Don Hetman and his simple and bold speech and way of living. She had dined with him alone when still Empress, something that would not have gone unremarked in the Russian palace. Platov, from all wars, all battlefields, kept a constant correspondence with her. In 1807, he had described to the Empress the Don Cossacks. "According to my duty as my strength and knowledge, I had laboured, most gracious majesty. I tell you this not to praise myself, but in truth. In the past months I have taken so many senior officers prisoner, I have lost count of them. I assume the army chief to whom I have delivered them knows. The daring Don Cossacks annihilated all the enemy cavalry, and the infantry they lost a lot. They sit now in Danzig like mice in their holes." During the Russo-Franco peace that followed the Treaty of Tilsit, his operations once again moved south. In 1808 to 1809, he was active against the Turks in the Danube Valley, including at the Battle of Silistra, receiving the Order of St. Vladimir First Class. On the 11th of October 1809, Platov was promoted to General of the Cavalry, and soon after the end of the campaign, he returned to his capital of Novocherkassk and continued the reorganisation of the local Cossack administration. The most important changes he brought about for us wargamers were that he instigated horse artillery to be attached to Cossack formations, and that brigades of multinational Cossacks be formed. So as I said earlier on, the Cossacks were still quite tribal, and you would just have Don Cossacks, and if 20 Don Cossacks rocked up, well, they wouldn't operate in a unit with the Liensk Cossacks next to them or whatever. Under Platov, that wasn't a consideration. A Cossack was a Cossack, and you would serve in a much more formal capacity than had been the case previously. Now, don't get me wrong, it was not formal. It wasn't like the Russian army or the French army or the Austrians, certainly nothing like the Prussians. It was still fairly ragtag, and you came along, you brought your bow and you brought your pony, and you did what you did until you decided to go home again. But there was a lot more central administration than there had been up to that point. But peace could not settle over Europe for long, and eventually the storm broke. Napoleon invaded the sacred lands of Mother Russia in 1812, and once again Platov found himself at war with France. The Cossacks, being outside the regular command structure of the Russian army, supported General Bagration's Second Western Army, and despite being well into his 60s, Platov's years of Spartan living, hard training, and the belief in the traditions of the Cossack paid off. Famous for only sleeping 4 hours a night, he and his small grey pony were everywhere, and he led his corps into the Korelichi engagement at Mir and at Romanov. They also provided the rearguard during the retreat towards Mogilyov. During the Russian counterattack at Smolensk, Platov fought at Molovo Boloto, and at the Battle of Borodino, he, together with General of Cavalry Fyodor Ushakov, conducted a manoeuvre against the French left, which was the northern flank. It failed to effectively threaten the French, resulting in Platov not receiving a decoration for the battle. Although ironically, it was later disclosed in his memoirs that the raid had had a dramatic effect on Napoleon, causing him to hold back the French Imperial Guard. But if there's one thing that we think of when we hear the word Cossack, it's the retreat from Moscow. And in 1812, Platov and his men hounded the French all the way back to Paris. He received the title Count of the Russian Empire for his command of the Cossacks during this time, and it's really in their element during this retreat. No French stragglers were safe, no messengers could get through without the massive escorts, and no bridge could be found that the Cossacks hadn't got to first. It was these constant Cossack raids, led by Platov and coordinated by him, that did so much to turn the retreat from Moscow into the horrific nightmare that it was for the French and her allies. Leipzig was to be Platov's last pitched battle, but it didn't end there because they harassed the French all the way back to Paris. After all, as Marshal Ney says,
"There's no hope, sire.
We are defeated, sire.
For 20 years we followed you. You made a road of glory through Europe.
We cannot even save the suburbs of Paris.
The Austrians. They're in Versailles. The Cossacks are watering the horses in the Seine. They can hear the Prussian cannon in Montmartre."
In the immediate peace after the fall of Paris, Platov accompanied Emperor Alexander on his state visit to London. Here the old general was awarded another golden sword, so for any of you who are keeping count, he's now got more golden swords than he does arms to wield them. And for me, the most bizarre thing that he was awarded was an honorary degree by Oxford University. So that would mean that he's also qualifies for a master's, because he's got a degree from Oxford. And while he was there, he had a full-length portrait being painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence for the Waterloo Chamber, created in Windsor Castle by George IV, who was then obviously the Prince Regent. Platov, after his victorious tour around Britain, returned to Novocherkassk and continued to reform the way of life for the Cossacks. In 1817, he established a school and the first printing press of the region. He understood that as well as teaching pupils, they needed to keep the Cossack traditions alive, and so archery and horsemanship were part of the curriculum. He also introduced new breeding stock into the Cossack horses. He was especially fond of English, although by English, probably Irish, horses, and he realised that while the steppe ponies were incredibly hardy, they didn't have the speed or size of Western European horses. So he started a breeding programme of Irish horses and the Cossack ponies. Mikhail Platov died on January the 3rd, 1818. Despite the bitter cold, the whole army of the Don, generals, officers, and many Cossacks attended his funeral. He was interred in the Cathedral of Novocherkassk on the left-hand side of the apse, the place of honour. He had a full military service, and I wanted to read this out in the original text as I got it from, the Russian translated. And I do this not because, I want to mock the way it's translated or anything like that. But I think I want to keep the spirit of the Russian idiom about it. So they're talking about the attendees of the funeral. They, quote, trembled and swayed, frosty air, and poured out bitter tears on the faces of the generals, officers and ordinary rank-and-file Cossacks. There was their father Ataman, defending their case, who loved them as his detushek. So he loved him as his own family. And thus died one of the fathers of the Cossack people. There's been a lot of stuff that was awarded to him over his career. And I just wanted to put it all in one place at the end, because it's crazy. So he wore the, big breath, Orders of the St. Apostle Andrew, the St. Alexander Nevsky, decorated with diamonds, the St. Great Martyr George, and the second degree the Grand Cross, the St. Apostolic Prince Vladimir of the first degree, and the St. John of Jerusalem. He also wore the Austrian Cross of Maria Theresa, third degree, the German crosses of the Black and the Red Eagle, first class, and he also had a portrait of the English Prince Regent as a blue ribbon garter. He was issued with 3 golden swords, one of which was inscribed for bravery and adorned with diamonds, awarded personally by Empress Catherine the Great. He also had a diamond pen and a shako with the monogram of Tsar Alexander I bestowed to him after Leipzig. He was given another sword from the City of London, and, as I mentioned, his honorary degree from Oxford University, and 3 medals for the capture of Ishmael, for the campaign of 1812, and for his title of Count. Now that's some achievement for the son of a barely literate sergeant, I think. But there's one more title that he was given, and I think it's the most important of them all. He was Ataman of the Cossacks. For the Cossacks, he is synonymous with them. Not long after his death, a statue was erected to him, paid for by public donations. He was placed in the capital he founded until 1923 in Novocherkassk. On the granite base in gold lettering was inscribed Count Ataman Platov for military feats, 1770 to 1816. And he was replicated there in 1993, so you can actually, there'll be some pictures of the statue in this video. There's also equestrian monuments to him in Novocherkassk, as you'd expect, in Rostov-on-Don and Moscow. Gavrila Dzhavin dedicated the last of his odes to Platov's exploits, so he was a Russian poet. In Leskov's Levsha in 1881, Don Cossack Platov is a prominent figure. And, you know, even though his portrayal in that is the start of the sort of anachronisms, the myth-making around him. And finally, now, I think this is fairly unique amongst Napoleonic generals. I cannot think of a single Napoleonic general who's had this honour. I might be wrong. If I am, please let me know in the comments. But finally, he has an international airport named after him. The airport that serves Rostov-on-Don, that was opened in 2017 for the Olympics. Sorry, was it the Olympics or was it the World Cup? No, I think it was the Olympics, yeah. That was open for the Olympics. Was named after him, so you can fly into the Platov airport. He was originally buried in the Novocherkassk Cathedral, but after that cathedral underwent major changes in 1875, he was exhumed and he's now buried in his family graveyard at his former estate. So that's the life of General Platov. I think a fascinating figure, and he really came to my attention because of a wargaming miniature that's made for him. So, as with all these videos, I like to do the history and the exploits of these famous people, and then look at how we can use them on the tabletop. Because as I've said a few times, this is not a history channel, this is a wargaming channel. So, Platov actually has rules in A Clash of Eagles. It's only one line, and they're not super impressive. He gives you a free regiment of Cossack cavalry, and he can issue a follow me order to a brigade. So I've mentioned that before, particularly in LaSalle. And that's certainly one idea for him. Now, an idea that I had for him was slightly different. So, for me, he should be leading a brigade of Cossacks, of course. Now, that could be free Cossacks as a free addition to your army. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But for his rules, I would say that obviously he's got to be independent. He's got to be very aggressive. And I'd like to try and wrap up the fact that he instilled traditional Cossack values in his men as well. So in the Clash of Eagles, you get the option to exchange lances for bows on your Cossacks. I would say that at least one unit has to do that. That's a compulsory choice. They've got to go with the bow. Who can forget the awesome spectacle of him like doing an archery demonstration, and then so not to be in the debt to the French Emperor, just giving him his bow? Awesome. So at least one of the regiments of Cossacks have to be bow armed. But because he promoted the skills and the classic nature of the Cossack, the morale save for me should be 4+ for that brigade. Shouldn't be the normal 5+. And that's not necessarily, because they're better armoured or anything like that, but it's because it's a morale save, so they've got better self-belief in themselves, because they are Platov's troops, and he's instilled all these great Cossack ideals into them. Miniature-wise, now, he's quite a unique figure. He's not like Crawford, he's a bit more like LaSalle, in that he's very unusually dressed. Now, there is a figure out there for him. It's the only one that I've found, and it's the figure that I saw and first got me interested in him. It's from Front Rank. Now, it's a one-piece casting, and it's a little 2D-tastic. He's sort of trotting sideways on his horse. You'll see on the figure, now I'll put it, my version of him, I'll put on the screen now. Not only is he surrounded by comely Cossack ladies, because, every light cavalry commander should be, and I just wanted to do so with the figures. I needed to spot them somewhere, and I thought they looked cool on his base. So he's surrounded by his Cossacks, and you'll see, I think one of the first things that that I notice on him is that he's holding a mace. Now, I think that's really cool. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, who's this guy with a mace? That's a bit different. I mean, I now know he had 3 golden swords and a mace, so, he was fully equipped. But the mace is a traditional badge of office for the hetman. It goes back to... it's weird, maces seem to be badges of office right back to ancient times. The Assyrian officers used maces. Egyptian officers potentially used maces. But it's certainly a symbol of the Cossack military aspect. Something I found about recently is the office of the General Staff of the Russian Army. They have a sort of like symbol, and instead of having crossed swords like we have for our army, they have a sword and a mace crossed. So it's still a thing, it's still a symbol of Russian military power now, and I think it represents the Cossack element of it. So if you convert your own, now I'm not saying that would be impossible. You can see he's got a Busby on with quite an impressive plume. Now, they're out there that you could use the plastic ones from the Perry Hussars quite easily. I'm sure the Warlord Hussars or Chasseurs have got the same ones as well. So you could go with that. But for me, the crucial element is making his mace. Now, the mace he's got here is a flanged mace. I don't know if he carried a flanged mace. Again, though, that's the symbol that they use on the Russian Chief of Staff. I'll throw a picture up here just to show you what I'm talking about. And for me, a miniature of Platov without the mace, it's a little bit like having a model of Picton without an umbrella and a top hat, or a model of LaSalle not with his pipe. It's sort of, that's who he is, that's his identity in that one thing there. So if you are going to convert your own, I'd stick a mace on there if possible. There's loads of ones you can get out there from plastic medieval kits and things like that. So that's it. General Mikhail Platov, a true figure from history, both militarily and civilly as well. He's very little known in the West, but if you're a Cossack, you almost revere him almost like an ancestor spirit. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Thank you for listening this long. If you've got anyone who you'd like to see included in this series, please leave him down in the comments below. There's a Hungarian chap who I'm looking into at the moment that was recommended by one of my viewers. Now, I've got quite a few of these lined up ready to record, so it wouldn't be the next one, but please let me know, and I'll get to them eventually. I'm really enjoying doing this series. The thing that's really amazing me about it is how incredible these people really were. I mean, some of their exploits, phenomenal. The amount of awards that Platov got. Now, maybe they were all earned, maybe they weren't. Maybe some of them were sops. But even so, you can't take it away from him. The man, for the son of a barely literate sergeant in the Russian army, under Catherine the Great, for him to be such a prominent figure on the world stage, absolutely phenomenal. So, that's been General Platov. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.